So, of course, I share in the acknowledgement, the wonderful acknowledgement that Charles made to the traditional owners. My name is Claire Moore. I have the great pleasure sometimes of being the Queensland Chair of the United Nations Association. And thank you so much, Charles, for welcoming us into today's event. It's a really important one, and we feel it's an important place for the UNAA to be. With me today are two members of our board, Annette Brownlee and Clem Campbell, both of whom will be asking questions because they're like that. But it's really important that I think that we actually look at the context, including that wider international context of the United Nations. So our session now has got the heading Historical and Strategic Context. We have three awesome speakers. If you want to know more about them, not all about them, but more about them, read the program because you've got their history there, and I've warned them all that I'm not going to go through all of that. What's going to happen is that each speaker will do their presentation, and then when we open to questions, there's going to be microphones. There are microphones at both sides, so people can go to the one that's closest to them. And then you can either direct a question to one person, or more likely, let all three have a go, and then people could come up and answer it. So that should be fine. Tao, you have the onerous job of being timekeeper. We respect that. So for the three speakers, that's Tao in the third row there. And also, I've been asked to remind people about mask wearing. It's policy at Griffith, particularly in a public space, to do that. And we have, and thank you, Griffith, we have provided masks outside. How many places do you go to now where they say you should have a mask and there's no masks? So thank you, Griffith, as always, a leader. Now, our first speaker is Professor Peter Dean, who's the Director of the University of Western Australia Defence and Security Program. Our second speaker, so I'm not going to be running up and interrupting it, you'll know it's like a tag team. When Professor Dean finishes, he'll be replaced at the microphone by Lieutenant General retired, it's a bit like us really, retired, John Sanderson, who is the former head of the UN forces in Cambodia, the Chief of Army and the Western Australian Governor for, where are you? How many terms? 6 years. Survivor, well done, yes. So, and our third speaker is Miss Danielle Chubb, who's the founding member of the Polis Group in the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. So there she is, yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do apologise totally. We'll get rid of that because I was actually at something yesterday where someone said, don't say it. And the person who was in the chair said, to get through a PhD is bloody hard work and it should always be acknowledged. So I'm with you. So it's Dr. Danielle Chubb, and congratulations on the PhD. What will happen, the three speakers will go, then I'll pop up again just to make sure that people aren't fighting with each other at the microphones to get to the questions, but that will be how the session will run. So welcome to each of our speakers, and Professor Dean, good luck with the technology.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the technology is just for me to read off so I don't kill some more trees. But if I'd known we'd have such a large screen, I would have gone for some maps or some photographs. Good morning, everyone. And I just want to thank Charles and Griffith University and the MacArthur Museum and to, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are gathering here today. This is an anniversary about Douglas MacArthur. I wrote a book about Douglas MacArthur, so I thought, being the first one after Bob Carter speak, I'd do a bit of an historical piece around MacArthur, but also use that very much in a way to reflect on the contemporary US-Australian alliance and some things that we should consider and some lessons we can take away. I spend pretty much all of my time now working on the contemporary alliance rather than the historical one, and that will become even more prescient on Monday week when I become the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre in my new role. But to go backwards and talk about MacArthur a bit, for over 70 years, as we know, there has been a formal alliance between the United States and Australia. And during this period, Australian and US interests in the Indo-Pacific region and globally have been tied together by geography, intelligence and security cooperation, economics, the support of liberal democracy, and what is known as a rules-based global order. Over time, this relationship has been one of the closest alliances in modern times, ranging from the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation to combined military operations in Korea, South Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, thousands of US and Australian personnel serve on operations, exchange, in liaison and staff positions in each other's militaries, including, as Bob mentioned, an Australian Army General who serves as the Deputy Commander United States Army Pacific. To many, the US-Australian alliance was forged in the dark days of the Pacific War and has continued ever since. This special relationship, it is called, is founded on a mutual understanding of two roughly similar societies, both once colonies of Great Britain, aligned by similar frontier foundation myths, as well as complementary values and culture, who were driven together by an assault by imperialist Japan. This notion has become a part of the alliance mythology. The starting point of this relationship is seen by many to be the 27th of December 1941, when, as it was discussed this morning, Curtin said those famous words, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks of America, free of any pangs to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." Now, ever since Curtin wrote these immortal words, Australian Prime Ministers and United States Presidents have spoken of the long and enduring friendship between Australia and the United States and the development of this relationship through war. However, in the period up to the Second World War, there was no significant military contact between these two nations. Despite the oratory of contemporary political leaders, it is important to remember that there was no alliance in 1942. There had been no mutual defence planning in the lead up to the war, no joint exercises and little work on interoperability, if at all. When the South West Pacific Area Command was set up in 1942, it was not an alliance but rather a coalition. That is, a temporary ad hoc arrangement united against a specified enemy. The alliance that the Australian public and politicians on both sides of the Pacific like to recall did not form until the signing of the formal treaty in 1951, and even then it would be years before it matured into an important strategic partnership for both countries. In fact, it was not until 1964 that an Australian strategic basis policy document called this relationship Australia's most important strategic partnership. Now, what emerges from the investigation of the wartime coalition is that it's fundamentally ad hoc, profoundly asymmetrical, and deeply dominated by US Army General Douglas MacArthur. The dominance of MacArthur is reflected in my title of my paper today, and I chose that deliberately, not because of his infamous persona and name recognition, but mainly because he was the dominating force and personality in the theatre. As it will be revealed, it was his coalition, it was forged and evolved under his leadership, and ultimately it operated on his terms. Now, traditionally, there is a greater emphasis on the smaller power to manage a coalition in order to exert its authority and to influence the dominant power. As the great international affairs scholar Coral Bell wrote in her treatise on the US-Australian alliance dependent ally, the patron is high on the client's horizon. The client, except in special circumstances, is low on the patron's horizon. As such, the Australian government and military were heavily focused on managing the coalition with the United States. MacArthur, however, could afford a much more narrow view concentrated on US national priorities, or in fact MacArthur's own personal priorities, especially from late 1943, when the US forces in the theatre became predominant. With a major inequity in strategic power between the two countries, when strategic interests and objectives were mutually aligned, as they were in 42 and 43, there was an exceptionally high degree of cooperation, especially at the operational and tactical levels. It was only after the true asymmetry of the relationship became apparent and that strategic interests started to diverge that the relationship became strategically and operationally dysfunctional in the last year of the war. Ultimately, however, it should be noted that this was a successful coalition. Despite its ad hoc nature, it was victorious in defeating the Japanese in the theatre, and this is highlighted by the triumphs in battle that the Allies had. It is, however, worth exploring in some more detail how MacArthur's command and leadership operated in Australia and how we can reflect on lessons Australia has used and has tried to use as it later forged one of the closest alliances in the world today. Now, to go back to March of 1942, MacArthur received a directive from the US Joint Chiefs of Staff outlining his command and responsibilities. That made him Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in the area, irrespective of nationality from which they derived, although it did note that he was not, quote, eligible to command directly any national force. To carry out his mission, MacArthur set up General Headquarters, GHQ, to command and exercise authority in the theatre. And despite orders to the contrary, all senior officers appointed to GHQ were American. and all but 3 had been with MacArthur in the Philippines. MacArthur's refusal to budge on this issue meant that his headquarters would stand in stark contrast to the approach Eisenhower would take when he established Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force to command the European theatre of operations. So the Australian Air Force, Navy and Army, it was an inauspicious start to their relationship with their new Commander-in-Chief. Underneath GHQ, MacArthur had 3 senior combatant commanders, a commander of Allied Naval Forces, Air Forces and Land Forces. The first 2 were placed under US officers, Admiral Herbert F. Leary and Lieutenant General George Brett in the first instance, and the Australian General Sir Thomas Blamey, who the Australian government had only recently ordered back from the Middle East and made Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces, became the Land Forces combatant commander. All national contingents would come under the command of these 3 services, at least for the first year of the war, until MacArthur found a way around that as well. Now, MacArthur recalled in his memoirs on arrival in Australia that he, quote, replaced the pessimism of failure with the inspiration of success. What the Australians needed was a strategy that held out the promise of victory. The Australian Chiefs of Staff had been thinking and planning only defensively, behind this so-called Brisbane line, a concept that was purely of passive defence and I felt would result only in eventual defeat. I decided to abandon the plan completely, to move 1,000 miles forward to the eastern Papua and to stop the Japanese on the rough mountains of the Owen Stanley Range of New Guinea, to make a fight for Australia beyond its own borders. And the decision gave the Australians an exhilarating lift. Now, this recollection contains nothing more than a small kernel of truth hidden behind a fabricated reality. In Australian parlance, it's bullshit. Like much, if not all, of MacArthur's writing, press statements and announcements, it was part of a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign aimed at unabashed self-promotion. The Australian Chiefs of Staff and General Brett, the American General Brett, and the Australian government's appreciations of the strategic situation in February and March of 42 were based on the premise of the development of Australia as a base for offensive operations against Japan. As David Horner and a number of other writers have demonstrated comprehensively, there was no Brisbane line, and efforts had been underway before MacArthur arrived to prepare Papua for defence against the Japanese. In fact, shortly after his arrival, MacArthur accepted virtually all of the strategic assessments of the Australian Chiefs of Staff. The major difference between MacArthur's assessments and the Australians was that GHQ believed that the Japanese would soon attack Darwin with 3 divisions, while the Australians correctly assessed they would focus their attack on Papua and Port Moresby. Now, after making his way to Melbourne in southern Australia, MacArthur addressed a knot of reporters who he gathered to greet him, and John mentioned this morning. The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines and proceed from Corregidor to Australia for the purpose, as I understand it, of organising an American offensive against Japan, the primary objective which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through and I shall return. Now, this statement is fascinating in what it reveals about MacArthur's intentions, makes no mention of Australia other than the fact the President ordered him there, paid no heed to the security of the defence of the nation which found him standing, and he spoke only of an American offensive rather than an Allied one. In his memoirs, MacArthur recalled upon arrival that, quote, as quickly as possible I arranged a conference with the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. I put my arm about his strong shoulder and said, Mr. Prime Minister, we two, you and I, shall see this thing through together. We can do it and we will do it. You take care of the rear and I will handle the front. Now, MacArthur's recollection is indicative of his personality and reputation as one of the more colourful officers in US military history. Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Wilkinson, the British liaison officer at the South West Pacific headquarters, described him as, quote, shrewd, proud, remote, highly strung and vastly vain. He has imagination, self-confidence, physical courage and charm, but no humour about himself, no regard at all to the truth, and is completely unaware of these defects. He mistakes emotions and ambitions for principles, and with moral depth he would be a great man, but as it is, he's a near miss, which may be worse than a mile. MacArthur's Air Force Commander, First Air Force Commander, Lieutenant General Brett, described him as, quote, a brilliant, temperamental egotist, a handsome man who can be as charming as anyone who ever lived, or as harshly indifferent to the needs and desires of those around him. His religion is deeply a part of his nature, and everything about MacArthur is on a grand scale. His virtues, his triumph, his intellect, and his shortcomings. Now, MacArthur and the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin would have formed an exceptionally close and mutually supportive relationship over the next 2 years. Curtin, a Labor Party Prime Minister and former trade union official, had little experience in military affairs. And the great irony of the MacArthur-Curtin relationship was that it was between a left-wing, almost socialist Australian Prime Minister and an ardent conservative Republican-American general, unlikely collaborators at the best of times. Recollections of the Curtin-MacArthur relationship note a number of important characteristics. Curtin is often represented as a leader heavily pressured by the burden of his wartime role, and this has been reinforced by the fact that, like President Roosevelt, he died in office in 1945, just before the war ended. Curtin is often portrayed as an admirable man who worked judiciously to achieve the best outcome for his country while the nation was on the back foot, as one of Australia's greatest, if not greatest ever, Prime Minister. However, that representation of working judiciously and working hard but in the shadow of MacArthur is one that is noted of Australian weakness and incompetence versus American strength. Now, MacArthur's arrival in Melbourne and later his move here to Brisbane heralded a major change in the dynamics of the way Australian strategy was made. The Australian command structure was completely reversed, and where previously the Australian Chiefs of Staff had been the principal advisor to the government, they were now replaced by a foreign general, and their role became more administrative. MacArthur took over all operational control of the Australian forces in the region and was directly responsible for the defence of the continent. Most significantly, Curtin, supported by his Secretary of Defence, Frederick Shedden, looked to MacArthur as the main source of strategic advice for the government. And as David Horner has noted, in placing Australian forces under MacArthur, the Australian federal government surrendered a large measure of sovereignty. But considering the Australia's limited strength and the magnitude of the Japanese threat at the time, Curtin had no alternative. Now, prior to the arrival of MacArthur, the Australian government had valiantly pressed the case to be involved in the highest levels of authority for the setting of strategy for the war in the Pacific. As a very minor power, however, dependent, anxious and insecure, Australia found it difficult to influence high policy. It meant that, as Geoffrey Searle has noted, it's probably futile to deplore the loss of Australian sovereignty and the subservience involved in placing MacArthur in his command position. In particular, command arrangements and the relationship between Curtin and MacArthur developed in a manner which they did as a result of Australia's desire to influence strategic decision-making in the Pacific War. Australian representation had been excluded from the combined Chiefs of Staff, and there was no Australian representative on the US Joint Chiefs. Thus, the Australian government were looking for a way to influence Allied grand strategy. Some input had been possible via their representations on the Pacific War Council. However, it was made clear as to what would happen. It was not made clear as to what would happen to the views of the Australians or any other member if they disagreed with the British, American or combined Chiefs of Staff. So the Australian government was very sceptical of this approach. In its final form, the Pacific War Council, which was established in March of 1942, was divided after the Pacific was divided into British and US commands. The purpose was to give advice to the Joint Chiefs of Staff about setting strategic policy, and it was hopefully that the US Joint Chiefs would take direction from that council, but in fact the reverse happened. While the Pacific War Council did provide Australia, New Zealand and the Dutch with a voice, it could only make recommendations to the JCF, who largely ignored them. The British Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax thought the council was, quote, merely a facade. And Christopher Horn has noted that the US Joint Chiefs of Staff did not attend the meetings and that the council had no bearing on decision-making whatsoever. Now, as a result of this council being only advisory, the Secretary of Defence in Australia, Frederick Shedden, believed the only way Australia could influence Allied strategy in the Pacific was to use MacArthur's access to the Joint Chiefs through General Marshall. And this path would be highly dependent, therefore, on the relationship between MacArthur and Curtin. So it was fortuitous then, from the time of MacArthur's arrival in March of 1942, that MacArthur won the trust and confidence of the Australian government. MacArthur would call Curtin the heart and soul of Australia, and recalled in his memoirs that he developed with the Prime Minister a sense of mutual trust, cooperation and regard that was never once breached by word, thought or deed. Curtin would be one of MacArthur's staunchest political allies in the war, and together they campaigned earnestly and relentlessly through any channels available to garner more resources for Australia and for the theatre. Now, under this arrangement, the entire strategic decision-making structure in Australia was recast. As noted, MacArthur became the principal strategic advisor to the Prime Minister. And the body established to coordinate this decision-making process was the Prime Minister's War Conference. And that body consisted only of the Prime Minister and MacArthur, and such ministers and officers as the Prime Minister might decide to summon to attend. This decision was cemented MacArthur's position as the main and virtually sole military advisor to the Australian head of government. This Prime Minister's War Conference would be the mainspring of machinery for the higher direction of the war, and besides MacArthur and Curtin, the only other person to attend every single meeting was the Secretary of Defence, Frederick Shedden. So this triumvirate of Curtin, MacArthur and Shedden represented the consolidation of strategic policy-making power in Australia in 1942 and 1943. This was recognition of Curtin's approach by MacArthur and a clear set of there was also recognition by Curtin of MacArthur's clear limitations he set about this coalition. The Supreme Commander made it clear that Australia's turn to America was only temporary and specifically related to the defeat of Japan. The day after, as was mentioned this morning, the midget submarine raid on Sydney Harbour, MacArthur made the following statement that Shedden wrote down during the triumvirate's meeting: that the Commander-in-Chief desired to point out the distinctions between the United States and the United Kingdom and their relations and responsibilities to Australia, sentiment by ties of blood, sentiment and allegiance to the Crown. The United States was an ally whose aim was to win the war, and it had no sovereign interest in the integrity of Australia. In fact, in view of the strategical importance of Australia in the war with Japan, America's involvement there and this course of military action will probably be followed irrespective of the American relationship to whomever might be occupying Australia. The limitations of the relationship would remain present during the course of the war. And while Australia and MacArthur's strategic interests coincided, the system that worked around this war conference worked exceptionally effectively. But cracks would appear in late 1943 as the relative weight of the military forces in the two countries in the theatre changed, and MacArthur's plans and Australia's interests started to diverge. Despite these changes, there would be no move to alter the setup for the higher direction of the war, even though the Prime Minister's War Conference would meet far less frequently and MacArthur's concern for Australia's perspective on strategy would rapidly diminish. In September of 1944, MacArthur left Brisbane and was never to return. And as the geographical distance between him and the continent grew, he became less and less interested in Australia and its military forces. The events of 1945 revealed the difficulties for a minor power like Australia to carve out a strategy for itself in the face of the deliberations of major powers. In the end, the British and the US came to a mutually agreeable strategic solution to the British involvement in the Pacific War that suited their strategic interests and did nothing towards the needs of Australia. This meant that Australia's Imperial Force spent much of 1944 on the sidelines of the war, and when launched into battle in 1945 took part in a campaign in Borneo that was strategically and operationally irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Now, MacArthur had deliberately sought to exclude the Australians from major operations in the last part of the war, but the strong bond he had formed with Curtin and the government in the early part of the war had been predicated, however, on MacArthur's self-interest rather than the interests of Australia or a mutually beneficial alliance. This also reinforced the importance of basing true alliance relationships on more than transactional needs during wartime, and that such relations cannot be based on specific personalities. Rather, a broad alignment of strategic interests and objectives are critical, and these should form the basis of much deeper levels of engagement at the strategic, operational and tactical levels. As a result of the wartime experience, when Australia did form an alliance with the United States in 1951, it worked assiduously to ensure that it had direct access to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest levels of US strategic planning, as well as forming a closest possible relationship with the senior US officer in Hawaii. All of these measures were rebuffed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. Australia had wanted to put a senior officer inside the JCS and wanted an Australian embed in Pacific Command, but it was not until the early 2010s that these ambitions were realised. The other key factor in the wartime coalition was not only mutually aligned strategic interests that matter, but so does geography. During the Cold War, Australia was a strategic backwater for much of the time as the US tried to stay disengaged from Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. But now Australia's tyranny of distance has been replaced by the power of proximity to the world's most important strategic region, and with that comes both opportunities and risks. So the takeaways are simple. Geography, sovereignty and interest matter much more than values and personality. The latter are important, but they are no substitute for clear structures of command, clear processes of strategic policy making, and most significantly, a focus on where strategic interests do and do not align. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests and my fellow speakers and ladies and gentlemen. I must admit I appreciate being here. Let me take this mask off and breathe. Appreciate being here for this particular conference, but more importantly, I appreciate the United Nations Association people being in attendance. I think this is all about the United Nations more than anything else, and I'll talk about that as I go through my presentation. I've titled my presentation, "The Challenges for Australian Defence in a Changing Strategic Landscape." I actually toyed with the idea of calling it, "Is the defence of the Australian continent too important to be left to Australians?" And that's worth thinking about too in the current context. Our conference draws our attention to the events of 80 years ago in the midst of a global war that established the framework for international relations and the so-called rules-based strategic order that has existed from that time up to the present, or to the recent past. Despite the fact that General Douglas MacArthur saw the engagement with Australia as one of necessity, given the longer-term primacy of Great Britain in our affairs, there is little doubt that our alliance with our American friends, germinated in 1942, has been the dominant influence on the part of our nation, the part that our nation has played in that framework since then. Now, knowing that the ANZUS Treaty itself points to the primacy of the Security Council of the United Nations in determining action in the rules-based order, it's also appropriate, I think, for us to consider the effectiveness of that organisation in sustaining the world order over the 77 years of its existence. The use of the words Australian autonomy in our conference title suggests, however, that we are also called to address our nation's preparedness to prosper in an environment of emerging complexity and unforeseen dynamics, what some people call chaos. The Trilateral Security Pact between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States of America, AUKUS, for example, signed in September 2021, moving Australia into a future of nuclear submarines and high-technology target acquisition, seemingly emerged out of nowhere, with little national debate or understanding of its implications. Two of the primary proponents of this arrangement, I must say, one looking for a post-Brexit role for his nation and the other looking for re-election, have both passed us by. As another visible sign of this chaos, the attendance of Japan, Australia, New Zealand and South Korea, but not India, as something more than observers at the most recent NATO summit in Madrid, suggests that a global alliance is attempting to be born from what has been a NATO confrontation with Russia in recent times. Now, the engagement of Australia's new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, in what US President Joe Biden has called the emerging conflict between liberal democracies and autocracies has expanded the conflict in Ukraine from a European struggle into a worldwide clash of nations embracing both the Indian and Pacific arenas. Who are the autocracies we are in conflict with? They may actually outnumber the liberal democracies, and there may be more of them in our immediate neighbourhood than we care to think about. I ask this question on the basis of assessment also that there's a low probability that China will change the practice of millennia to become a freedom-loving liberal democracy in the foreseeable future. The closest it ever came to that was in the early stages of the collapse of the Qing dynasty, just before the First World War. In all likelihood, it will continue to support autocratic regimes that share its approach to governance on the Belt and Road. From an Australian point of view, are we considering a significant departure from the past? In this regard, I note, as many have, that Hugh White's, one of the go-to scholars on global dynamics, has titled his latest foray on strategic analysis, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. Many will have read this latest view in the July quarterly. He's not really talking about shedding the alliance, but managing it in a more engaged and thoughtful way. How much flexibility is there to do either is a question that needs to be answered. Knowing that Hugh made his professional career out of furthering the alliance, as a fact that he admits, I'm sure he will have given consideration in depth to this question. The main thrust of his treatise is that we should discourage our American allies from confronting China in territorial waters that it considers as vital to its future, and cease locking ourselves into an American maritime strategy that will not be pursued in our interest. In particular, Hugh considers the adoption of a nuclear submarine option as folly, due to the way it will distort our defence program and reduce our flexibility in the chaos that's about to follow. Now, my expertise lies in the area of security and international peacekeeping with an Asian focus. On each occasion I've been asked to play a role, I've found it necessary to look at my task in a much broader historical and geographical context than the near-term analysis of people and events often allows. Hence my opening thoughts about China. This is because the passion that underlies the behaviour of the people you are dealing with often reflects deep and enduring scars of past injustices and fears that haunt the culture, as well as the mythology that informs their view of history. When you do this, of course, there is always the risk that you might come to realise that you are on the wrong side of history. This continent, although sparsely inhabited in modern times, constitutes the most significant feature in the Southern Hemisphere. With thousands of kilometres of coastal access to the Pacific, Southern and Indian Oceans, a massive maritime resources zone, Australia's proximity to to markets in Asia, massive mineral wealth near the surface of its ancient geology, including rare earths and other critical minerals, and the growing renewable energy and food production capacity make it a genuine prize in modern terms. Its only deficiencies are technical, i.e. an efficient transport and power distribution network, and a technologically capable workforce of sufficient magnitude and vitality to take advantage of these strategic assets. Australia had remained largely unexplored until after the American War of Independence, when the Admiralty gained agreement to establish a naval base on the eastern seaboard at Botany Bay. Subsequently, that had been discovered by Captain Cook, but subsequently moved around the corner to an even better anchorage in Port Jackson, and establishes a penal colony with the convicts sent along to do the work. Subsequently, a similar base was established on the west coast in 1828. Now, these far-flung colonies were not defendable from a British perspective. The cheapest approach to the protection of these places was to have a small naval presence on the Australia Station in Sydney Harbour, inside the anchorages, with a fortified coastal artillery presence on the entrances, and a mounted voluntary militia to delay any outflanking attempts, and of course some foot soldiers to keep the convicts and the Aborigines under control. The strategic idea was to try to hold on until the Admiralty could find the necessary resources to send from somewhere else in the Empire, such as the East India or China stations. This was the start point for Australian defence in 1901, when the former colonies were federated into one nation within the Empire and formed their own defence force. Would the British arrive on time to save the inhabitants was always the question behind the strategy. In the meantime, the naval arms race had continued throughout the 19th century as the rest of the European world industrialised and began to match the British development of heavily armoured and steam and oil-driven capital ships with massive guns of longer range and accuracy. The advent of the dreadnought battleship towards the end of the 19th century resulted in a strategic development that brought us to where we are today. Who could afford them was the question that induced nations to exploit the resources of other nations, including a commitment to taking control of the oil fields in the Middle East and the building of inter-ocean canals to reduce travel time. The ability of capital ships that could stand off and throw massive rounds with increasing accuracy at other ships and coastal cities had become the major determinant of global strategies. In principle, the trend towards longer-range submarines and aircraft carriers that eventually characterised the Second World War in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans cast Australia into this relationship with America that we are discussing today. In this process, the British and the Germans had helped the Japanese in the late 19th century to build a modern army and navy. First two commandants of the naval base at Koro Bay were British commandants, British admirals. To build a modern army and navy to prevent Russian intrusion into their Asian trading empires. After Japanese victory against the Russians in 1905, the First World War, fought mainly in Europe, lasted for 4 years after attempts to starve the Germans with naval and land blockades failed, and American participation after 1916 broke this stalemate. This left the world after the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations Agreement, and the Washington Naval Conference, which is an important part of this whole thing, with a resentful German and Japanese enemy, all gunned up with submarines and aircraft carriers, capital ships that would have to be subdued in the Second World War. With nationalist China obviously being the ally of choice for America in a struggle to prevent the development of a Japanese empire on mainland Asia, it should not have been a surprise when a carrier-based Japanese force made a preemptive strike against American capital ships in Pearl Harbor, and Japanese imperial troops took out the United States base in the Philippines and the British base in Singapore, bringing General MacArthur to Australia in 1942. The massive American response to this eventually invited them onto continental Europe to an extent they'd been trying to avoid for a century. Like the British, they were far more comfortable with a maritime strategy that was essentially about standing off from the ugly business of mass casualties and population suppression of continental warfare, while maintaining, of course, the unified support of a multicultural population at home. The sea power strategy, long promoted by the American strategist Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, dominated American post-war strategy, including the rebuilding of German and Japanese economies to provide trading partners and to withstand the threat of continental powers like Russia and China. America's experience of occasional forays into continental Asia and the Middle East since that time have confirmed the efficacy of this maritime strategy. A large proportion of Australia's defence budget over the last half century has been directed towards fitting in with this strategy. Now, it was to be nearly a quarter of a century before the People's Republic of China, established in 1949, was allowed to assume its place in the United Nations as a permanent member of the Security Council. In the meantime, the Nationalist Chinese Republic, based in Taiwan, held the seat with the support of the Americans. Despite this, after a period of great revolutionary agony under Mao Zedong, a massive threat from America over Korea, the PRC, from its position as a permanent member of the Security Council, eventually grew to love the idea of a global marketplace. However, it has never bought the idea of a rules-based order that is about maintaining the status quo, a status quo with which they disagree, particularly with regard to territories they believe belong to them and are an important part of their geostrategy of keeping outsiders out of their territorial waters. Because we keep telling people that we Australians live in Asia and that is where our future will lie, I thought it might be useful to reflect on my recent visit to Cambodia, where I had been the United Nations Peacekeeping Force commander in the Transition Authority in the early 1990s. I was invited back this year by the current Australian ambassador to participate in an event to launch a display to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the beginning of UNTAC and Australia's part in it, and the 70th anniversary of the beginning of diplomatic relations between our two countries, which incidentally started before full independence from France. It turned out to be a journey of 10 days with up to 4 major events a day, and I'd only signed up for one. I was received everywhere with great generosity, and my version of why the UN had gone there was well received, even though it clashed with the Cambodian Prime Minister's version of his role in saving the country. Hun Sen is the longest-serving Prime Minister in Asia, and it looks like his son will succeed him. The national development of the last 30 years was astonishing, given the fact that there are few Cambodian industries of substance except for some mining and a heavily COVID-affected tourist industry. Rice production has improved to the stage of having a surplus for export, and there is a massive cassava industry in the old battlefields where landmine clearance is nearing completion. The national road system connecting provincial cities would put many Australian states to shame. In the cities, old Cambodia is hidden beneath the modern high-rise. The population has doubled. 67% of the population is under 30 years of age. They weren't born when we were there. And there are clear signs of a growing middle class throughout the countryside. Unfortunately, even though elections at the national and local levels continue to be held, there's little sign of an effective opposition or the human rights regime that was a key to the focus of the Paris Agreements of 1993 and the UN protocols and conventions. Cambodia is well and truly on the Belt and Road, with Chinese investment temporarily constrained by COVID, but massively noticeable. The Japanese have also invested heavily in both Vietnam and Cambodia. Neither nation seems to mind the fact that Cambodian democracy and Vietnamese democracy, for that matter, are less than liberal. Given the experience of conflict in Asia, perhaps we should not be surprised that political stability is valued more highly than human rights. Where does this leave us in the struggle between liberal democracies and autocracies? The fact that much goodwill towards Australia continues to exist in Cambodia to this day is a reflection of an enlightened period or enlightened periods of Australian foreign policy, going back to the time before the war in Vietnam, when Australia was active in supporting the independence and development of many former colonies in Asia, including Cambodia. The United Nations intervention in Cambodia was the result of a similar enlightened engagement by Australia in gaining a peace agreement and a UN-mandated mission to resolve the civil war resulting from the war in Vietnam. These activities have generally been more fruitful in terms of national interest than the various wars that Australia has participated in on behalf of its alliance with America. The truth of the matter is that without China's cooperation, there would be no peace in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge had provided agency to China's confrontation with Russia in Vietnam and the South China Sea. The collapse of the Soviet Union subsequently provided an opportunity for both China and Japan to seek to stabilise Southeast Asia as an arena for economic competition. Now, ANZUS is only one of the agreements from which Australian defence has benefited over the last 70 years. The quadripartite agreements that constitute an alliance of English-speaking countries, including America, Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, for the sharing of standardisation of weapons and practices, intelligence, science and technology, research, communications, have made a profound contribution to defence knowledge over that time. Apart from the technical dimension of these agreements, the exchange of military personnel in command, staff and training positions have made an enormous contribution to the understanding of the doctrinal philosophy of their fellow English-speaking allies, as well as insights into the thinking of members of other associated alliances, such as NATO. At the core of ANZUS and all its other defence treaties, America has borne the cost of an Allied ascendancy in aerospace. These exchanges have allowed the Australian Defence Force to operate at a very high level of advanced warfare, albeit with a significant dependency on the United States of America for supporting command and control systems and the maintenance of embedded systems of technology. A move towards a nuclear submarine force, such as proposed within the AUKUS agreement, could be expected to magnify this dependency towards a point of minimal flexibility, with the operational and technical support of such a force being conducted in another country. Clearly, the Americans do not provide the support out of the kindness of their hearts. These are evolving relationships that generally rely on an evolving contribution. The more you put in, the more you get back. Sometimes it's been recognised that in Australia's case, the putting in has included basing American forces on Australian soil and flag carrying in American activities where few Australian interests are at stake. Fortunately, so far, casualties have been able to maintain at a level judged as sustainable in terms of Australian public support. A more serious immediate challenge for Australian defence lies, and this is about the United Nations, lies in the issue of the integrity of international interventions and who decides who is right and who is wrong. In recent years, Australia is recognised internationally as taking a position that America is always right. The rules-based order actually says it's the Security Council of the United Nations that mandates operations on this basis. The ANZUS Treaty supports this, as I've said. The stumbling blocks to this process have been growing in magnitude for a considerable time, with a coalition of the willing, including Australia, invading Iraq, a member of the United Nations, in 2003 without the mandate from the United Nations, a direct affront to the rules-based order. This occurred at a time when a Republican administration of the United States of America increasingly attacked the United Nations as actively acting against the interests of America. This has been a constant American theme as more of its operations in various parts of the world have failed to produce regimes favourable to its interests, particularly in the Middle East. This fragmentation of the rules-based order has been magnified by both Russia and China taking advantage of confusion and weakness in the Western leadership to act unilaterally in the Ukraine and the South China Sea. Why wouldn't they? This suggests that the rules-based order is no more, and Australia is being asked to take sides against the major power in its adjoining region, one that is also its major trading partner. Where does our flexibility lie in this emerging situation? Now, China's never been an expansionist maritime power. Even at the height of its imperial power, its primary focus as a hegemon was on creating stability under an umbrella of peaceful inclusion in a system that recognised its primacy. Before the Europeans arrived, threats generally emerged from the north and the west, and there are big risks for them in extending their hegemony beyond these traditional boundaries. A massive country, it's always experienced trouble in controlling its warlords and making sure they did not make arrangements contrary to the interests of the centre. This is what Taiwan's all about. It will be interesting for the future to see whether the leadership of the Communist Party is better at assuring this control than the divine emperors of the past. A question of equal interest, I think, is whether the advances in information technology has moved the Chinese leadership into a more populist and expansionist mode in order to enhance their control at the centre, such as we're seeing in Russia at the present time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. Let me just conclude by saying how to generate respect from the major power in the region is going to be a fundamental aspect of our future strategy. Much of the solution will be found in the non-military dimensions of the growth of food and energy contributions and a willingness and commitment to mutually supporting trade arrangements. But the development and control of military technology that increases Australia's flexibility vis-à-vis America would seem to be a major contributor to both the building of respect and a more fruitful partnership with our neighbouring countries. In saying this, I acknowledge the fact that on this tectonic plate that we all live on, there is another 300 million people who also have to make their contributions to the future and ensure their own safety. So the nature of the military technological approach to this is, I think, a subject for another conference. But thank you all for listening.
Hi everyone. I was going to start today with an apology for making a fuss about my title, because I don't actually care about titles, but instead I think I'll just kind of provide by way of explanation, and without at all suggesting that this is what happened today, that this year, 12 years after getting my PhD, and as I head into the liberation of middle age, I resolved to myself that I was going to call it out when it happened, because I work in a space where women's contributions, and again, I'm not saying this is what happened today, but where women's contributions are continually underrepresented, continually undervalued. And it's exhausting to continually have to point it out. And being a difficult woman doesn't make you friends. But I remind myself actually that the generation of women who came before me had a much bigger fight on their hands, right, to get equality in the workplace. The generation before them had to fight for suffrage. So I just hope that the efforts of my generation will help the students in my lecture theatres, more than half of whom are women, or my daughter, as they go on to have their careers, to focus on other things. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. How do I go backwards on this? There we go. All right, so my work on public opinion is motivated by the central principle that foreign and defence policy shouldn't be considered an elite domain, right? That's disconnected from the lives of everyday people. Actually, on the contrary, I believe that how a state pursues these policies does have real implications for the lives of everyday people. So understanding public opinion is crucial because it tells us something important about the ideas and the values that animate a society's internal debates about two important things. Firstly, the character of the national interest that the government of the day continually professes to pursue, and that's not fixed in stone, that changes. It's a changing beast that morphs over time. And also, it says something about how a society wishes to allocate its resources. And so, when we look at Australian public opinion towards the US alliance, from the public's perspective, the US alliance is one of the most well understood and best recognised aspects of Australian defence policy. It attracts regular media discussion and attention, particularly through frequent events like AUSMIN, joint military exercises, visits by heads of state and other officials, and at times of crisis, of course, it comes to the fore. And we saw that back in 2001 when you started to see ANZUS being talked about in the media for perhaps the first time in a long time, this acronym that the Australian public more broadly started to be exposed to. And of course, it's also true that at times of crisis, or at times where our commitment to the alliance involves contributions such as troop deployments, having the support and the backing of the Australian public is fundamental. You need that, or you can't send your women and your men abroad. So the research I've been doing is based on a book I published last year with Professor Ian McAllister at the Australian National University, and it looks at public opinion towards Australian foreign defence policy since the end of World War II. And it was really an opportune time to do this because for the first time we had this massive data. So advances in public opinion, in polling on public opinion, has allowed us to write this book. Before the late 1980s, defence and foreign affairs topics were rarely included in commercial polls, and where they were, the coverage was sporadic, survey questions weren't repeated, we couldn't get a sense of kind of how opinion was changing over time. Because, you know, we asked the Australian public just recently, what do you think about AUKUS? But I don't think you can tell much from that one poll, right? You need to have systematic, continual, repeated questions over time to see what the trends are. But since 1987 and the introduction of the Australian Electoral Study Survey, which my co-author has been running since that time, and then particularly again since 2005 and the introduction of the annual Lowy Institute survey. So the Australian Electoral Study, some of you may know and some of you may not, it polls the full gamut of policy, opinion towards policy at election time. But the annual Lowy Institute survey is specifically focused on foreign and defence policy, and it takes place every year. So now we've got this database on public opinion available for secondary analysis. And so for the first time, we're able to write this book showing, giving a systematic study of longitudinal trends in public opinion and foreign affairs. So I'm going to just today, in the time I've got allotted to me, share with you some of what we know about what Australians think about the US alliance. So two of the key findings of this data are that over the past 70 years, we've seen a lot, first of all, that we've seen strong and persistent public support. This is what we would call in the public opinion space, it almost comes to a valence issue, which means that it's an issue on which virtually everyone is agreed. There's a general consensus among Australians, first, that defence is important, and there's a general agreement that Australia would be unable to mount a serious defence without significant external assistance, as we've heard discussed today in the history of Australia's relationship with great and powerful friends. And so in this context, a defence alliance with the United States of America receives overwhelming public support. And given this overwhelming public support, this valence, that it's almost a valence issue, the only variable we really consider is the strength of that support. So keep that in mind when we're talking about fluctuations. We're not talking about fluctuations in whether or not the public supports the alliance. We're talking about fluctuations in how strong that support is. And we expect the intensity of that support to vary over time as a result of specific events, as a result of, and this is very relevant to us today, changing circumstances in the external international environment. We might also expect that there's an effect when it comes to age, because we know that younger people are less keen on the alliance than older people, but I'll come back to that later. So first, briefly back in time to some of the first commercial polls on the US alliance. So at this time, as we know, Australians were concerned about the likelihood of another world war. And evidence from that period shows that they were concerned particularly about security within the region, about the threat of communism in particular, and also about the threat of a resurgent Japan. 3 opinion polls conducted, I wanted to go back. 3 opinion polls conducted between 44 and 48 show increasing public concern about the possibility of a war with Russia specifically within the next 25 years. And you can see that between 1942 and 1948, the proportion of those who thought that there would be a war in the next 25 years with Russia increased from 42% to almost 2/3 of the population, which is quite high. And also, most notably, I think, the proportion of people who did not have a view on the topic declined from almost a quarter of respondents in the first poll just a few years later to just 4%, which is an almost negligible number. And this reflects the increasing frequency of public debate on the potential threats that were emerging in the region. So it tells us something about what people were talking about, what was happening in the media, what our politicians were discussing. Attitudes towards Russia. So we can see that the public viewed Russia specifically as representing a considerable security threat. Its annexation of parts of Eastern Europe, for example, raised concern among Australians that this is a model that could be applied to our region. And so when asked about their views of Russia's military intentions, surveys in 46 and 47 show increasing public scepticism about Russian motivations. In 1946, almost half of those believed that Russia wanted to become a quote-unquote ruling world power, and just a year on, almost 2/3 believed that Russia had become an aggressor nation, reflecting what it was doing at those times. We've mentioned the UN briefly today, so just, I think contextually, it's I think something else that plays a role in the way Australians were thinking about how they could protect themselves, were that there was increasing widespread dissatisfaction with the conflict resolution capabilities of the United Nations. While early discussions in the post-war years about the formation of an international body, and of course Australia was deeply and intimately involved in those discussions, that at that time we had seen lots of public support for the UN around that time. But by 1946, opinions were actually evenly divided between satisfaction, dissatisfaction, and no opinion. And you can see that between 46 and 48, these views didn't change very much. And then finally, so how did people, with all that in our background, what did people think about a security treaty with the United States? Given this unstable international context, the public was extremely receptive to the idea of a security treaty with the US. There's not a lot of direct survey evidence on this topic from that period of time, but the Australian Gallup poll did do a survey in 1950 asking about views on a possible treaty, and an overwhelming majority of respondents, 87%, were in favour of it, and just a few were either opposed to it or didn't have a view on this matter. And so concerns about post-war security, the perceived ineffectiveness of the UN in dealing with regional conflicts, gratitude for US support during the Second World War, all combined to make support for a mutual defence treaty with the US a logical choice and a popular choice with the public. And of course, at this time, I think the beginning of the Korean War, Australia's willingness to commit troops quickly also played a role in predisposing respondents towards supporting a treaty. All right, so I'm going to show you lots of polls because you can't talk about public opinion without polls. In general, the trends show that the public has the greatest confidence in the United States when it demonstrates an active willingness to engage in overseas conflict and or play a major role in world affairs. Perhaps that's unsurprising, right? I think the Australian public's attitudes towards the United States reflect the reality of what's happening out there, showing, I think, that Australians actually have pretty nuanced and coherent views on these issues. So there was consequently greatest trust. We see the greatest trust in the US alliance immediately after the 9/11 attacks. In 2001, over 8 in every 10 respondents either had a great deal of trust in the US to defend Australia or a fair amount of trust. And the lowest level of trust occurs in 2000, just before 9/11, when only 22% said they had a great deal of trust in the United States coming to Australia's defence. This was the lowest figure in that period for which data was available. And at this significant, albeit momentary decline, probably was at least partly a public response to the US reaction to the East Timor crisis, when the US ruled out any military involvement and Australia took the lead. And then the lower levels of trust in the mid-2000s show a degree of unpopularity with the FTA that we were negotiating with the US at that time, ratifying in 2004. And then you can see that the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016 and its full implications for US military involvement around the world, based on what the president was saying at that time about his views on American commitments abroad, show that only 23% of respondents said they had very great trust. We're waiting still, currently, they're crunching the numbers for the 2022 Australian electoral study. I expect those numbers to rebound to the levels that we saw during not quite to the levels I think that we saw during the Obama administration, but much higher than they are now. And one of the reasons I think that is because we have some other evidence that tells us from Lowy that that might be true. So we can compare the question of how much the Australian public trusts the US to come to their defence with this question that has been asked by the Lowy Institute around how much do you trust the United States to act responsibly in the world. They asked this question in the context of a great deal of countries, and the United States is one of them. And we can see here that this trust went down during the Trump years quite significantly. It was at its highest during the Obama years, and it has started to rebound since then, but has not gone up too quickly. And there are a whole lot of, I didn't include them for matters of time, but there's a lot of other questions that are being asked around what is happening inside the United States. And it reflects that Australians are concerned about stability and political crisis inside the United States. So again, I think it shows a great deal of nuance with Australians looking at America as a reliable and stable ally and reflecting on how likely it is to kind of commit its resources to the region or to act responsibly, quote unquote, responsibly in the world. And then the final one I wanted to show is that when it comes to, this is the question directly about the US alliance. This is not about trust in the United States. It's not about views on what kind of a player the US is. It's the question of how much support do you support the US alliance? So the questions are, how important do you think that the US alliance is for protecting Australia's security, and also how important is that relationship for Australia's security? So we can see that the support has been relatively consistent over the 20-year period of the surveys. The Australian electoral study has more consistent results. That's the top line. This is potentially because it is conducted every 3 years. And there are some small differences in methodology, but while the Lowy Institute responses vary more than the AES, they also, if you look at the trend line, it's quite similar. And I think you can expect that once we have the AES data for 2022, we'll be able to see that moving in the same direction. So we can see that support for the alliance has rebounded in 2022. To the extent that there's been any change, then it's been in respondents moving between seeing the alliance as very important and fairly important, rather than moving in the direction of seeing the alliance as unimportant. Moreover, the trends show that those taking a strong position in favour of ANZUS are proportionally greater than those who take a strong stance against it. So it's a stable and continuing backdrop to the public's views about Australian foreign and defence policy. And then finally, the consistent importance of age across the three surveys, across these surveys, is often cited as evidence that support for the US alliance will wane with coming generations. When we delve into the data, we can see that support for the alliance is lower among younger people. And this observation is based on the idea that support for the alliance is highest among older respondents, especially those who grew up during the Second World War, and to a lesser extent during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and implies that public support will gradually decline as these generations leave the population, which is the tactical way of putting it in opinion data. Underlying this finding is the view that public support for the US alliance is based on generations and their associated life experiences, but the data tells us that that's not actually true. It's not true, as some might argue, that newer generations who don't possess the experience of growing up when the alliance was vitally important to Australia's existential security place less value on it. We can see that with each generation, support for the alliance increases with age, suggesting that a life cycle effect is present. So we don't expect support for the alliance to change markedly over time. So what could bring about change? That's something I think that governments need to think about, because this consistent and strong public support for the US alliance is something that governments have come to rely upon, I think. And the survey evidence shows that it's been consistently high for as long as opinion polls have asked us about it, with a modest decline following the election of Donald Trump. To the extent there have been fluctuations, it's been in intensity of support and not willingness to support the alliance. For all intents and purposes, then, it is a valence issue rather than a positional one. This does not divide the parties, it does not divide voters, and no major party has sought to politicise it. And while concern for weakening support of the alliance has focused on generational change, the data actually shows that any change related to age appears to be a consequence of ageing itself, and that the effects of different generations are actually quite minor. Another possible driver of changes towards attitudes in the alliance is immigration, and especially the changing nature of the Australian population, immigration from Southeast Asia. And when looking at the data, you can see that, and I haven't shown you this data because they're this really complicated and boring regression tables, but what I can tell you is that there are statistically significant effects in the surveys based on whether somebody was either born overseas in Southeast Asia or has a parent born in Southeast Asia. But while it's statistically significant, it's not a really meaningful change. And any meaningful impact on overall attitudes based on immigration will likely take effect, but it will take generations. So it's something that we're going to see moving forward into the future. It's not something of immediate relevance to us. A more likely shift of attitudes in the shorter term is likely to occur from a black swan event, that it brings about a rift in bipartisan consensus for support for the alliance. So what does matter? What we know matters when it comes to public opinion are the actions of major party leaders, particularly Liberal leaders. What Liberal leaders say about the alliance has an effect on what people think about the alliance. We see a strongly positive relationship, net of other factors, between the incumbent Liberal leader and support for the US alliance, which is interesting. And it shows, of course, the importance of elite consensus to the alliance. I think it also shows that a debate at the elite level would actually have some kind of effect on public opinion, and how that debate is conducted. And of course, we've talked a lot about Hugh White today, and that is exactly what he's trying to promote. He's not saying we need to his main argument when you speak to him and when he's talking in the public, he's saying, I want you guys to talk about this. Let's have a debate. And it's true that White's work has had a debate. I was living in the US in 2011, in Hawaii, so around people who care a lot about the US alliance with Australia, and people will continue, this was around the first time, I think, of the China Choice essay that came out, and people were continually asking me about these questions. So while we've seen political parties move away from or resist calls that come up from time to time to submit the alliance to greater public scrutiny, to submit troop deployments, for example, to public debate. Well, we've seen major parties resist this, and likely it's because politicians are aware that they must resist turning the US alliance into a political battleground if they want to enjoy the continued support of the Australian people for the alliance as it stands today. This is probably the only ways in which we're going to see any change. So that's what I think we need to look out for. Thanks so much.
Your authoritative position there, maintain that. You've got about 35 minutes for questions, so I remind people you can go from both sides of the room, and as Charles explained earlier, we have someone from the UNAA go on asking the first question, so please come down as you will. Go ahead.
That was amazing, all of you. Thank you so much. I guess my first question is kind of directed to all of you. But given the historical and strategic context of this alliance, why do you think it's important in today's geopolitical climate?
I think it was, why is it still geopolitically relevant and important? Well, I'm a strategic studies scholar, so I'll talk probably more about hard power than anything else. But and to use Hugh, we quoted Hugh a lot, and Hugh wrote a piece on Australian defence policy, like sort of a broader history of it. One of the things he's always said is Australia's response to security issues is driven by fear, weakness and anxiety. This is driven about our geographical place in the world. The fact that we have 7.7 million square kilometres of Australian landmass and 0.33% of the population. And we live in a part of the world that at times has been safe and secure and at other times been very unsafe and very insecure. So then that comes down to what benefits does the alliance provide us? Well, we've been allied, in my view, to a great and powerful friend that in the period since the Second World War was one of the major dominant powers that helped set up and help govern and help drive that rules-based international order that we have prospered about. It's cost us less to defend Australia. If you take the alliance away and you decide to maintain your sovereignty through being able to have a credible defence force, the studies that have been done into this, and Hugh White's an advocate for this, so a more independent Australian defence posture, it's not going to cost 2% of GDP that we spend now. It's going to cost 4, 6, 7, or in my calculation, around 8 to 9% of GDP. So think of how many schools, hospitals, roads, ports and other infrastructure we would have to spend, not purchase and not develop and not do if we gave up the alliance. Now the offset is then, okay, you do the New Zealand option and you don't have a credible defence force. The small difference is we don't have a very large country called Australia between us and the rest of the Asian world. And then we go back to the fact that you leave yourself vulnerable in your sovereignty terms because you're actually not able as a population and a government to maintain your own sovereignty independently. So then you fall back, as it is, on the other countries of the region being good and nice neighbours to you. And there's issues of coercion there. So we also get advanced technology from the United States. We also see it largely, and this is hard to prove, but it's also generally viewed, and Bob would probably have a better understanding of this than me, that because we have such a close relationship with the United States of America, it allows a small to middle power to actually have more influence inside Washington, but also to be listened to by other states in our region and around the world because we have that in with the United States of America. And I would lastly say that we live in a more vulnerable world. Now, it's very trite to say, and particularly people like me to stand up and go, we live in a world unlike any other, right? But I would quote Alan Gingell here, the former head of the Lowy Institute in ONI, who said a couple of years ago that, you know, that said a lot, but this time it's actually really true. So for the first time since the British people came to Australia, other than the period of 1941 to 1945, we live in a world where our major power ally is not the dominant maritime power in the region, or if not the hegemon of the region. There is now a genuine contest of power in our region. There is genuine multipolarity in the region, and the US is no longer the hegemon. It is not. It hasn't been for years. The Trump administration tried to say this was an aim. They were asking for an aim of something they hadn't had for years, right? For any realistic scholar who understands that regional environment. So it's a very unstable and insecure environment. It's full of dangers, as Bob pointed out. The last thing we want to do is go to war with China. And then add into this other things like climate change and economic dislocation, where the United States still remains the second largest economy in the world and the greatest provider of direct foreign investment into Australia. Now, there are problems that we have, but every single Australian government since Federation has looked at the analysis of this and decided that an alliance with a great and powerful friend has been in Australia's interests, and 80% of the Australian population agree. That would be my quick summary of what some people have written books on this. I've written books on this, so it's my quick attempt to summary it.
I would like to support some of what was said there. This is a chaotic environment that we're moving into. The only time we've been asked to become truly strategic is when the Japanese were coming down the archipelago. And fear was the dominant factor behind Australia starting to think strategically. And when we have the dumbest constitution in the world for actually defending a continent, I mean, and it's just a remnant of a British colonial experience. I mean, how do we think that a division of a continent, the way we've got it at the moment with 2.5 million people living in Western Australia, where most of our GDP is coming from, and everybody living in these big cities in the southeast corner, how do we think that's going to constitute a secure continent for the long-term future? We've been bludgeoning. The only thing I agree with what's just been said is we like it because it was cheap and we could sit around in these cities and do what we wanted to do, lying around on the beach, building the slums of the future in the inner city area, and having a transport network that's actually falling way behind Asia. You know, there's some serious thinking to be done in this if we want to be independent throughout the rest of this century. Will we be the masters of this continent at the end of this century? That's the good question that needs to be answered.
It's a good broad-reaching question, which I think is why we all have something to say about it. So I'll answer the question by drawing on the public opinion data, and I've just brought with me the Lowy polls. So this year the Lowy polls showed us that in the past couple of years, I'm just talking since 2020, concerns Australians have had when it comes to the question of what are the main critical threats we see facing Australia have been climate change consistently. Around 2/3 of the population see climate change as a critical threat, and things like cyber attacks from other countries, terrorism, North Korea's nuclear program, depending on what North Korea is doing at that time. This year, and so they've been mostly non-traditional threats, right? Climate change, global downturn, pandemics. This year, the same proportion of people are concerned about climate change, still 2/3 of Australians, but they are just as concerned, if not more concerned, about things like Russia's foreign policy and China's foreign policy. So we're seeing more traditional threats come into the region, which I think reflects this growing understanding among the Australian population that something is changing, that American primacy cannot be taken for granted, right? And in that context, we also know, and this goes back to what Peter was saying, that while Australians wildly support the US alliance, while Australians have high levels of trust in defence as an institution, in the Australian Defence Force, one of the most trusted institutions in Australian society, Australians are extremely unwilling to spend money on it. And when asked where they want to spend their resources, they want to spend it on health, they want to spend it on education, they want to spend it on social services and aged care, and defence is right down the bottom. And so I think that does reflect the fact that there aren't any good options for Australian governments right now. And yet we're facing what the Australian public also recognises as these critical threats.
I've got a question to ask, because people know more about defence than I do. To Peter, and I love military history, and I'm going to be devouring your books on the Second World War. And to John, alternative history. What if Australia had armed itself with a fleet of submarines? Was it ever considered in the 30s? I don't recall it being considered. And if my memory is right, we lost 2 capital ships to the Japanese in the Second World War. The Perth in the Battle of the Java Sea, and we lost another battleship in the slot of the Solomons, Canberra. If Australia had had a dozen submarines as a result of creative defence thinking by the Lyons government or some quick thinking by Curtin's government in the 40s, would it have been feasible, and would it have been a real threat to the Japanese military, the Japanese naval presence encroaching on our waters? And for you and John, what if the Australian government, instead of leaping on the AUKUS proposal, which came out of the blue, no discussion, nothing has hit us with more surprise in this area than this nation, what if we said we're going to protect Australia's waters well into our north with a large, reliable fleet of conventional submarines? We're not going to have to wait until 2045 to get them either.
So on the first thing with the submarines, yeah, entirely feasible in the 1930s. In fact, it was being done, but it was being done by the Royal Navy. So Rear Admiral James Goldrick, retired, who's a great military historian and former Australian naval officer, has written a good paper on this, where the original protection for the British in the Far East was actually based on the China Squadron up in Hong Kong, but also in Singapore, of very large numbers of very long-range diesel-electric submarines. And during the late 20s and into the 30s, these were actually based there, and they would have played a significant role in the Pacific War. And there was, I believe, some discussion, but it was ruled out because of technical difficulties and the small nature of our Navy about being able to supplement that fleet, but there was discussions about that. And the issue was that the war in Europe started, and the demand for Allied submarines of that particular type that were modern and long range was so high they just got wilted off bit by bit, eventually, and went back to the Mediterranean and went back to Europe, to eventually there was basically none left. But if you had, I think, a much more imaginative view of the way Australia could have defended itself in the 20s and 30s, then you would have looked for probably a different style of Navy, and because the Navy was still seen as an auxiliary of the fleet we expected to come to Singapore. But again, if you look at the Singapore strategy in the Australian governments in the 20s and 30s, we didn't want to spend the money on Australia's defence. By the time we get to 1937 and we understand the threat and we do want to spend the money, we can't spend the money because we don't have the local manufacturing capability, and all the major world's armaments factories that we are allied to in the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe were flat out producing modern weapons, planes, aircraft, ships and for their own countries. And I think this is one of the drivers in the modern parlance, for instance, why we're talking about a sovereign Australian missile capability now. That is because the realisation is if we ever have to look after ourselves in one way, shape, form or another, if we don't have that sovereign missile capability and we rely on buying those from the United States of America and the factories they've got that can't continue to supply them enough, you're pretty well sunk. And sorry, Bob, the second part of your question was the more contemporary? Right now, the conventional submarines. Yeah, look, I think the issue that we're facing with the nuclear-powered submarines is they are far superior on everything we need them for from an operational and tactical point of view from all the submariners that I've spoken to because of range and distance. So a nuclear-powered submarine, if we send to Australia's north from our base in Western Australia, can spend over 70 days in the Indonesian archipelago and the South China Sea on station in operations. And it's only restricted on doing that by the amount of food it can carry, because it can generate its own fresh water and it's got its own power plant that will go forever if you want it to. By the time our diesel-electric submarines do that, it spends more time transiting from Australian waters to those waters to undertake operations. It uses up the majority of its fuel, its food, and its other capabilities to do that. And also a nuclear-powered submarine can do that transit time at 3 times the speed, with far less chance of being detected. The offset is once it gets to the Indonesian archipelago, an diesel-electric submarine is actually quieter and more able to operate in the shallower water in the Indonesian archipelago. So if you really wanted to do this from a complete military strategy point of view without other political factors in a tactical operation, you would have a mixed fleet of boats that are capable of doing both, and you'd have a lot more of them like Hugh is argued for, and that would provide for a real independent deterrent effect, but again, it would be very, very costly.
Let me just say, Bob, I've never met a submariner who hasn't overstated the potency of the capability that they float around. And you have to be like that if you're going to go around in submarines. And just to put this into focus, we're talking about capital ships that move at 40 kilometres an hour in a flat two-dimensional plane. And we're talking about control of missiles that go at 10,000 kilometres an hour from space, control with huge accuracy. I've never met a Navy officer who's able to explain to me how the mathematics of that obvious formula works. And submarines are coming into that category as well. I suspect that most submarines can be detected from space. Now, I mean, they can hide. I've got a son-in-law who's a submarine engineer. He tries to explain all these things to me. But look, that stuff has dominated our defence budget for the last half a century. Okay, and it would even get worse, and doesn't leave us much option to do anything else.
My understanding is the density of water is too big for satellite communications, but there are other technologies, and I know some of my staff at UWA have been working on this, where you can detect nuclear, particularly powered submarines by the particular things that nuclear power gives off in water particles. So that's, another thing. But the other big thing in technology that will be the counterpoint to this, what submarines will be in the future is not what they are now. They'll be motherships for autonomous vehicles. And the benefit of a nuclear-powered submarine over a diesel-electric powered submarine is a nuclear-powered submarine has unlimited reserves of power, and you need that power to operate the autonomous systems that you need to operate from the submarine. And that's the other great advantage looking at a future technology race in underwater.
Seems to me there's a lot of talk about spending money, our money, on weapons. $270 billion is the estimated cost of the nuclear submarines. That's just one little part of it. You know, we have pledged as a nation to be spending huge sums of money over the next 10 years to arm up. And the big winners from that really are the weapons industries. They're the ones that are really winning in this war. My question, or my area of interest, was what Danielle had to talk about, and I think public opinion is very much at the mercy of historical events, but also of the media and the sort of messages that are coming from the leaders that we have in our country. The Independent and Peaceful Australia Network that I chair decided a couple of years ago to run an inquiry into the costs and consequences of the wars that we've engaged in since World War II. So we had an amazing response, and I'll talk to you, Danielle, about it later. We're about to deliver the report, hopefully tabled in Parliament. But around about 300 people responded from all walks of life, academics, people living in the Blue Mountains, faith groups, unions. My own union, the Nurses Union of Australia, put in a submission. So it was quite, it had a reasonably good breadth of opinion coming back, of which the dominant responses were that we've made huge errors in continuing to follow the United States into wars that have not been won, and as I said, the only real winners have been the weapons manufacturing companies. I remember when that missile was launched by the United States on a location in Syria a few years ago. And I looked up the cost of one of those missiles. Just one was $800,000. Gone. And then another order to produce another one. So I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about weapons and we've got to have this whiz-bang thing and we've got to have that whiz-bang thing. But I come back to really what Bob was saying earlier on, the importance of avoiding war, and the only way we can really avoid war is through diplomacy, through talking and engagement. And that's where I'll leave it. But Danielle, I guess I'd like your sort of opinion on just how big the influence is on public opinion by the media, by our governmental leaders. And the other thing I did want to actually bring up was that was mentioned, you know, that also affects public opinion is our attitude of dependence on a you know, big foreign power, and our vulnerability. I think that's something you hear a lot. We feel vulnerable as a white nation in this part of the world. Less so as time goes on. But I'm also interested in what you think, Danielle, about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and in fact, okay. In fact, how significant that will be in actually addressing that sense of vulnerability and weakness that we feel as a nation.
There's a lot there, so I'll just try to be brief because I know we're heading towards or we're past lunchtime. So the question of how important is the media and what our leaders say, it's extremely important. In fact, it's the dominant effect. And Australians are continually told that defence and foreign policy is an extremely complex area that they can't hope to understand. And, you know, I teach first-year international relations students, and one of the things I do, because I've discovered that they don't read the news because they think it's too hard to understand, is get them to read the news and to learn how to read the news. And I completely dismiss the idea that foreign defence policy is a more complex area. My husband works in the carbon abatement emissions field. It's much more complicated. I have no idea what he does. Whereas he understands military history quite well because he watches lots of documentaries. Yeah, the elite consensus is important. I mean, we can see that, but it is very hard for leaders. I mean, I don't envy them that job. So we can look at Iraq. Australians did not support going into Iraq, and Kim Beazley stood up and you know, represented that view. But once the decision is made to send our troops into a conflict, the rally around the flag effect is so important for politics. And if Kim Beazley had continued to maintain the line that we shouldn't be there, it would have been seen as not supporting our troops in Iraq. And so that's where debate becomes really complicated. And that's why the Greens, for example, have been arguing that the decision to deploy troops should be subject to parliamentary debate, something that the major parties have resisted for the reasons I've outlined. The question of the Uluru Statement for the Heart, I don't have a lot to say about it, except that I think we can see from the region, we know from what our diplomats say when they're out there in the world, that people ask Australians about the plight of Indigenous people. We know that as Australians travelling in the world, and our diplomats certainly experience that at the UN, and it's used as a bargaining point for other countries who don't wish to, you know, when Australia criticises North Korea on its human rights situation, something I know a bit about, North Korea will be like, well, have a look at what you guys are doing at home. And so that doesn't really answer the question, but I'll stop there because we're short of time.
Very quickly, because there was a lot in what you had to say. A couple of things. I think the cost of war and manufacturing versus the cost of not preparing for war. That's the big unknown question, right? The Defence Force is the only area of public policy where we spend money on it on the hope we don't have to use it and hope we don't have to have an outcome. And so it's impossible for me to tell you, or anybody else in this room to say, if we spend zero on defence, that will have no consequence, or if we spend 10% on defence, that will make us secure. The really thing I hate about using GDP as a measure of defence spending, GDP goes up and down. If you're in a recession, it goes down, and you spend the more on defence, it goes up. But there is no magic number that makes us secure. And so it's all about managing risk. So it's about the government deciding with the Australian population how much risk they think they can manage and offset with the Defence Force. The one thing I'll push back on is we've never fought the United States wars. We've never gone to war because of the United States of America. And anyone who says that is a cop-out on Australian sovereignty and a cop-out on every Australian government who's made its own decisions. You want to blame someone for those wars you don't like, you blame the Australian politicians at the time and our government at the time, because we've always maintained sovereignty over that decision. Now, we've made decisions to go to wars that were unpopular, like Iraq, which I protested against, and I was in the military at the time and I didn't want to go because I had issues with it and stuff, but it was still a sovereign decision that John Howard and his government made. And the same about Vietnam. Vietnam is a classic irony of the Australian government asked the Americans to ask the South Vietnamese to ask us to go to war. And we did that on the belief that we could hopefully be on the side of the Americans who would win the war in Southeast Asia, and our aim was to keep the United States fighting a war in Southeast Asia because we thought it was in our strategic interests. So I think one of the things we've always maintained, those decisions belong to Australian governments. We've never fought a war, and I've read all the historical documents on this because the Americans have told us to. It's because we thought it's in our strategic interests. So what we're going to do as a nation is hold our governments to account if we think that's the wrong decision. So if something happens over Taiwan, it's not because of the Americans, it would be because of what our government decides to do. And as a people in a liberal democracy, we need to hold that to account. The last thing I'll mention is diplomacy. One of the greatest travesties in the last 20 or 30 years of Australian political life has been the degradation of DFAT and the driving down of our diplomacy efforts. I'm a defence scholar. Right, $270 billion is the extra spending on defence. I would like to have seen a good chunk of that go to DFAT instead. Because and I say this as a defence scholar, strategic studies scholar, yeah, sure, every dollar you take off diplomacy and DFAT you give to us, we just got to buy more bombs because it's their job to stop the war. You know, it's our job to fight the war, and we don't really want to fight the war to start with. So I'm really glad to see that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese have committed to re-invitalising DFAT, to having much more of a diplomatic effort, and we should be leading with that more than what we saw from the last government, who just leaned forevermore with macho stuff and spending more money on defence with no context. And what we saw happen in the Solomon Islands was a failure of Australian diplomacy, not a failure of Australian defence effort, and buying one more missile or one more bomb would never have changed that, but investing in more of a deeper relationship in that region and, you know, being able to talk about their number one security issue, climate change, from a position of actually believing in it would have really been a good place to start, and that's where diplomacy now has suddenly massively shifted for us. So, I'm very hopeful we spend less on defence and more on diplomacy, and that will help us make a bit more secure as well.
Claire, thank you. I think my question is probably to General Sanderson and Professor Dean, and it's a controversial one, I think. But, gentlemen, do you think that it is impossible that you can totally rule out the possibility that in, let's say, 10, more likely 20 years' time, that Australia might think it's possible, or it's in its interest, to procure nuclear weapons? On this basis, that we're not a country that, is seeking to enlarge our territory, that it's solely for defence, and we won't brook any interference with our sovereignty. Difficult question, I know, General, but I thought I'd ask you, sir, and thank you, Professor.
One of the things I wanted to say, if I'd had more time, as a consequence of the Ukraine war, we see very clear evidence that nuclear powers don't go to war with each other. There's a huge reluctance to do that. And it's understandable, because if you've ever been in the business of nuclear targeting, you know that the possibility, once the trigger has been pulled, that it will not stop and the whole Earth will be destroyed. The whole environment will be destroyed. So when you go into the idea of becoming a part of this sort of nuclear family, if I could put it that way, it's only as a deterrent, and it's going to cost you an enormous amount to stay in the business, and it's going to destroy a lot of your flexibility with respect to other things. And the question is, the only way out of it is feet first. You know, it's a disaster. And frankly, I mean, I still wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweat with the realisation that I once used to teach nuclear targeting. And I thought, this is ridiculous. But, the whole European posture, when the Soviet Union was in full gun, was based on what they call mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And I remember one of the nuclear strategists coming and describing to us, so it was like a game of chicken. The only way that you could actually win was in a game of chicken was to be seen drinking a full bottle of whiskey before you got in the car. You need an irrational dimension to, and so far the Americans are the only ones who've used nuclear weapons against human beings. Leave it there.
yes, a controversial question, but an interesting one. And I'll start with, I don't have it on me, but there was, in the Lowy poll this year, they asked that question. And I was absolutely floored to find around about 30% of Australians are willing to consider it. I think you would have asked that question a couple of years ago and you would have got 2 or 3 or 4% maybe. To mention Hugh again, Hugh in his book on how to defend Australia has a chapter at the end that, you know, at some point we might have to consider getting nuclear weapons. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. Nuclear proliferation is one. And if you look at the AUKUS deal, for instance, on nuclear-powered submarines, DFAT has an entire task force, its sole job to ensure that we do not breach nuclear proliferation requirements. They are hugely focused on that, and it has to be done in a way that we don't contribute to that. I think there's, in my mind, when I try and use my historical imagination, what's the scenario where this might be plausible or this might be happening? And it comes back to the United States and the alliance with the United States. So I wrote a piece recently that said, because the US has lost hegemony and uncontested maritime supremacy, they can no longer do conventional deterrence by themselves against another great power in the region like China. And this is what, if you've heard of integrated defence, is all about. The United States has realised this and they're trying to empower their allies to be able to be more powerful so they can aggregate that power to try and maintain a balance of power. They don't want primacy back, it's just about a balance of power. That's what AUKUS is about. But US nuclear deterrence in this region still holds, and it's a key plank of Australian defence policy. Because if we don't have it, we could be coerced by a nuclear power and we have no sort of comeback. And the great hypothetical here is what would have happened if Ukraine had still been a nuclear power? Would Russia have been willing to take it on in the way that it has? We don't know, but it's an interesting hypothetical. I think the situation where we could end up contemplating seriously nuclear weapons would go like this. The US in some way withdraws out of our region strategically and basically refuses to provide a nuclear guarantee that it does to countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, etc. At the moment, for Japan and Korea, South Korea in particular, the basic premise of this is that the Americans are willing to trade Los Angeles for Tokyo. And as long as you can convince your opponent they're willing to do that, deterrence holds, and they won't nuke Tokyo or Seoul and vice versa. The US withdraws and pulls that out. I would put a bet that somewhere between a week and a month later, the Japanese have a nuclear weapon. They are a nuclear power, industry power. They have all the high-tech electronics and components, and they have enough stuff sitting around to build that bomb very quickly. South Korea would then, because Japanese have it, and there's not a great relationship there, and the Chinese definitely have it, now the North Koreans have it, would be not very far behind. Their problem would be getting their hands on the fissile material, I would argue. And at that point, you're getting nuclear proliferation in the region, and at that point, we would be mad not to consider it. But if we do something preemptively, the Indonesians would be mad not to consider it, and the rest of the region would be mad not to consider it, and we probably wouldn't be successful, and we would become the North Korea of the South Pacific. Because the Americans wouldn't stand for it, and the region wouldn't stand for it. You want to become a pariah, announce you're going to become a nuclear power. Look how well it's done for North Korea. And set off that spiral. And once you have nuclear proliferation, it becomes even more unstable. The more people that have these things, the more unstable it gets. You actually are better off limiting the amount of weapons and better off ensuring that countries like China and the United States in the region both understand their nuclear powers and both understand that if it comes to it, they're willing to use it. So both understand that going to war over Taiwan would be the stupidest thing on the planet because it could end the planet. So it's a very complex area of strategy, and it's something that's very scary. And my hope is that, you know, the current posture that we have is maintained. Danielle works on North Korea. She's probably got a much more insightful idea about nuclear weapons.
How does India fit into your analysis there? How does India fit into your analysis?
Well, it's a nuclear power, and that relates to Pakistan being a nuclear power, which also relates to the fact that China's a nuclear power, which is on their border. What we've had is a level of stability there now for decades where we haven't had proliferation in that region.
But India's not a pariah.
Pardon?
India's not a pariah. They haven't fallen into that pariah category.
They're not a pariah? Pariah. No, well, they developed it in very different strategic circumstances, and they're a much larger power with a clear and more existential threat that they were facing. Yeah, and in a different region.
just in the context of the opinion polling, I would say I am not too concerned about that a third of Australians think we should get nuclear weapons, because it has occurred in the absence of any real conversation about what that means. People are just feeling scared because of what's happening in Ukraine. And if we have a debate in Parliament or in our mainstream newspapers, that will be more indicative, I think. And just one more thing to remember, that the Australian Labor Party has committed to signing the Nuclear Ban Treaty. ICANN, which won a Nobel Peace Prize, which was not recognised under the Turnbull government. I mean, that's crazy. They've worked with the Labor Party, and Albanese has a personal commitment. Tom Uren was in Nagasaki as prisoner of war, saw that the effects of nuclear proliferation. It appears to have had a big effect on Albanese. I don't know what their current position is. I think current external events make it difficult for them to move right now, but that is the state of affairs. And I agree with everything Peter said, that dystopian reality is just the reality of the security dilemma in which we live. But hopefully cooler heads will prevail. I'm much more concerned about South Korea and the level of support for nuclear weapons there. I think that's a much bigger concern. Yep.
We've got two more people wanting to ask questions, and we started at 10:44, so Charles, I would think we could go to 12:44. I'm seeking your approval for that. 12:40, okay. Actually, I've got three people standing up now, so I think you can only do two more questions. So you're first, and then Tao, you go first. Oh, you're leaning against the wall. That's fantastic. We've got these two women's questions, and that will go.
Hi, my name is Gemma Rodriguez. I'm originally from the Philippines, and I think some of the question that I was thinking before has been addressed. But since we're talking about war, there's a lot of issues in international relations, and these issues are also governed. There are lots of international treaties that governs our conduct, and especially the laws of war. And one of the United Nations aspiration was to eliminate war. And that was in the Charter. And we have other important issues as well, like, eradicating poverty, the non-traditional security. And yet, we are now in 2022, and we seem to psychoanalyze all this thing, that this is important, and that, the use of nuclear weapons is absolutely prohibited in the laws of war. And we talk about building this, and we saw in Ukraine that there are a lot of people that are, as the result of war. There's always a human cost aside from monetary. Why are we still thinking about this? We have climate change, we have people dying, we have migration, we have, other kind of interstate wars, and we also have corrupt politicians. Yes, why are we still thinking of building weapons? Why are we still thinking of traditional security? And what happened to diplomacy? Thank you.
Let me just say that I feel your pain about this. I mean, the United Nations was set up with the highest aspirations. And all of that, in fact, somehow or other, Doc Everett got individual rights included into the original charter, much against the will of some of the other participants in the process. But the whole range of human rights conventions and protocols that have emerged from the United Nations, it's an evolving institution. But, as I tried to explain in my presentation, one of its major proponents actually has indicated that their view of the rules-based order is their rules, and their order. And somehow or other, this is the human condition, that people can actually ignore the needs of other people and try and construct the international order in a way that suits them. I think you're right to suggest that we've got things like climate change and overpopulation, and exhaustion of our environment to contend with them. These are the things that create chaos. This is overlapping stuff, with plague, war, and these things. We are moving into a very shaky, chaotic environment. And the question is, how do we emerge out of this with a rules-based order that actually works?
So quickly, I think we all agree with the sentiment of what you said. I think no one would disagree with that. The issue, and I think it comes back to a key text like Hedley Bull's The Anarchical Society, about how the international system works. It's anarchy. We've established things like the United Nations and other bodies in attempts to control the rules of the road, but it's proven to be ineffective. So if you look just at the Australian example, at the end of the Second World War, which was just horrendous for Australia and the region, we put a lot of stock and faith in the United Nations, and Doc Evatt was there, and we were heavily involved in making sure, as a middle power, that there were rules of the road, and that might isn't right is the way that the world runs. And Australian defence policy, however, was always a hedge against the failure of that liberal international order. If that order fails, for whatever reason, you need to be able to have a defence force to defend yourself. And that's the basic premise. It's an insurance policy. Australia's always, from the end of the Second World War, we heavily invested in diplomacy and multilateralism. Multilateralism was key. If we gather other like-minded countries around us, hopefully we can set some rules and hopefully we can stop the worst of these things happening. It's been very effective in some elements and not so effective in other elements. And again, that's why I applaud the current government's commitment back to regional multilateralism and diplomacy, as opposed to putting increasing stock in just hard power and defence issues and that type of stuff. On the non-traditional security threats, we should be paying a lot more attention to them. Climate change, if you see from the Lowy polls and the other things, is of grave concern to the Australian people, to our region. It's seen as a security threat. It's seen also as a threat to our existence and our way of life. It's gone from what in defence circles we call a threat multiplier to a threat generator. And we may or may not have war with China in the next 20 or 30 years, and God, I hope we don't, because no one wins out of that. No one really does. But I can guarantee you what we are going to do is have to put up with the outcomes and ramifications of climate change. That is absolutely guaranteed. And we need to spend more time focused on that, because that is an existential threat that is going to happen. The one with China is something that may only happen, and as Bob said, we need to do more efforts into managing that doesn't happen. We can manage that way better than at the moment the globe seems to be able to manage climate change. My real concern as a hard power strategist person is what are the effects of climate change? Well, it's going to end up being less land for people, less water for people, less resources for people. And what do people over history go to war over? Less so ideology and more so land, water and resources, particularly when they come scarce. And so the issue we don't talk about a lot, that we often may face, is war and conflict in our region that's driven by the effects of climate change more than it is driven by great power competition. So they're things that, unfortunately, strategic studies scholars, we like to joke that we sit alone in the dark at night and drink scotch and think about all the bad things that are coming to get us. And we kind of do that a bit. But sometimes you need to think those things through, because it takes a very long time to develop defence and military capability or institutional capability. Look at our lack of institutional and national capability to fight bushfires, because we haven't invested in it, and it takes long to develop those capabilities. And we need capabilities that can help. The Defence Force is never going to solve climate change, but a lot of it's going to have to be structured to deal with the impact of climate change and the things we need to do, like peacekeeping operations that are not driven by war and conflict like General Sanderson had to deal with, but maybe driven by war and conflict as a result of climate effects and climate change and mass migration and things like that.
I think what differentiates strategic studies scholars like Peter, who ask these big and important but quite pessimistic and dark questions about how to avoid worst case scenarios, and international relations scholars who ask the kinds of questions that I think are motivated by the kinds of questions you're asking. How do we live in a world that is more equitable, safer, and more just? And the United Nations, of course, had at first this idea to eliminate war, but that was quickly, I think, they were quickly disillusioned of that. And, the Cold War made the UN less relevant, bipolar system, stability. And so when we came to the end of the Cold War, the world, when I say we, the world system started to say, okay, this idea of state security, even we have the Charter of Human Rights, but it hasn't necessarily been well enough thought about what are the limits on a state's sovereignty and how does our thinking about security as a state issue limit us from our imaginations, from thinking about strategic options beyond the state. And so that's when you started, this is IR 101, right? This is when you started, the Human Development Report came out and you started to say, well, maybe it's not state security we're talking about, but human security. And human security, these questions you're asking about. Human security allows us to say security, we have a sovereign state, not because we think the state is a great thing to have in and of itself, and we haven't always had a sovereign state system. We've had feudal systems, imperial systems. Right now, it's what we've got. It's really a construction of human imagination, but it exists to keep us all safe and secure, peoples and communities within it. And so we're moving, unfortunately, into an era where we've got an increasing focus back on state security because we're seeing shifts in the power balance, and that's inevitable. The question, I think, for our leaders is, how do we make sure we maintain, and it's a question for the UN in particular, maintain relevance? How do we focus our energies? We're not going to be able to solve all problems. We're not going to be able to force states that don't want to be liberal democracies to become liberal democracies. We need to just get rid of that idea. How do we really focus our energies on making sure that the world is going to be a place we can all live in and is going to be safer and better for more people? So they're big and difficult questions you're asking, but I think they're important ones, and we need to keep asking them. So thank you.
Of course, the sandwiches must be curling up. So look, very last and very simple question. As an Australian, I'm very intrigued by the expansionism of Emperor Xi Jinping towards the Pacific and the arrival of the big brothers, bombers, as I would like to say, the American B-2. Yes, I'd like to hear from Professor Dean and General Saunderson and, of course, Gabriel. What are their views? What is the exercise all about? And what do we expect? And on record, I think I heard someone say that we are still white. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be saying that, but census this year has pretty much made it clear we are a multicultural Australia, and we must absolutely not use those words. So thank you.